Welcome to Twisted Roots, where we tell the stories families often keep hidden, tales of sacrifice, betrayal, and hard-earned redemption. If these stories speak to you, please take a moment to subscribe. It helps us keep sharing narratives that may linger with you long after the video ends. Today's story is titled, "My Son Sold My House While I Was in the Hospital on Christmas Day. He texted, bye." Every story has a place where it begins. And this one begins with a house. Not just any house, but the kind you drive past and can feel someone's life beating inside of it. A modest two-story home, white paint weathered by too many winters, a porch railing slightly uneven from years of use, and a maple tree out front that leans protectively toward the roofline. To strangers, it was ordinary. To Merle Ferris, it was everything. Merle was 67 now, though his body often felt a decade older. His knees clicked when he climbed the steps, his fingers curled from years gripping pliers and wires in freezing storms. He had spent nearly 4 decades as a lineman, one of those men you only notice when the power goes out. Hurricanes, blizzards, blistering summers, dark midnights, Merle climbed poles so that other families could sleep with their lights on. The paychecks were never big, but they were steady. And with steady, a man like Merle could build something that outlasted him. Piece by piece, paycheck by paycheck, he bought the lot, laid the foundation, raised the beams. He hammered until his shoulders screamed, painted until his hands blistered, and by the end of it there stood a house. Not a mansion, not a palace, but a home. Inside that home, Edith laughed. She was his wife, his best friend, and the one who always complained that the house has too many drafts. She said it with annoyance, but Merle knew she loved the place anyway. The rocking chair by the window. He built it when Edith was expecting their first and only child, a boy they would name Garrett, though everyone just called him G. The maple tree in the yard, planted the day they signed the deed, its roots spreading even as the Ferris family did. Every corner of the house was stitched with memory. The dent in the kitchen wall from when little G tossed a baseball indoors. The worn edge of the stair rail where Edith rested her hand each morning. The oil stains in the garage from late nights teaching G how to change brake pads. For Merle, the house was more than shelter. It was a scrapbook of a life lived honestly, a promise carved into wood and stone. My family will always have a place to belong. And like so many fathers of his generation, Merle never asked for much in return. A hot meal, a roof that didn't leak, a family gathered around a Christmas tree each December. That was enough, but time has a way of bending promises. Edith passed, the laughter in the kitchen silenced. G grew restless. Left for college, then came back with a wife whose eyes always measured the worth of things in dollars. And Merle, well, he stayed in the same chair by the window, watching the seasons trade places through the bare branches of the maple tree. The winters were colder now, or maybe he was just older. Either way, the house seemed to creak louder in the silence. And though he would never admit it aloud, Merle sometimes feared that the very roof he had built, the very place he thought would hold his family together, might someday become the wedge that tore them apart. He never imagined that fear would come true. He never imagined that the house he built with love would be stolen not by strangers, but by the very blood it was meant to shelter. There are houses that hold memories like photographs pressed into old albums. And then there are houses that breathe with them, whispers tucked into every corner, footsteps echoing long after they are gone. For Merle Ferris, the house was alive with one presence above all, Edith. Edith had been gone for 5 years. 5 long winters without her voice calling from the kitchen, without her hand reaching across the table, without her steadying laugh that softened his stubbornness. She was the kind of woman who found something to notice in everything. The crack under the bedroom window, the squeak in the cellar door, the way Merle tracked mud in after a storm. "Merle," she used to say, "this place will fall apart if you don't keep after it." He would roll his eyes, mutter that it was fine, and then secretly fix it that weekend, because Edith was always right. She noticed the little things, the flaws, and somehow that made the house more perfect, not less. Now in her absence, Merle sometimes left the window cracked on purpose, just enough to let the curtains stir in the draft. He'd sit in his rocking chair, see the fabric flutter, and almost believe it was her, brushing past him, reminding him that even silence has weight. Evenings were the hardest. The light would fade behind the maple tree, the shadows stretching long across the living room floor, and the house would turn unbearably quiet. Merle often found himself speaking aloud. As if Edith were still across from him, telling her about his day, about the neighbor's dog digging up the flower bed, about the ache in his chest he didn't want to admit was worse this year than last. The photo on the mantel became his audience. Edith in her younger days, smiling, holding baby G in her arms. He would look at that picture until his eyes blurred. Sometimes he imagined her lips moving, answering back. He could almost hear her voice, almost. Loneliness is a strange thing. It doesn't just weigh on your shoulders, it reshapes the way you see the world. Merle began to notice how rare the phone rang, how fewer cars stopped in his driveway. Once holidays had meant laughter spilling out the windows, the smell of Edith's pies in the oven, Garrett's toys scattered on the rug. Now Christmas was a small tree in the corner, decorated by one man with too much time and too few reasons. His son still came now and then. Birthdays. Thanksgiving, Christmas, if they remembered. But the visits had grown shorter, the conversations thinner. Merle tried to tell himself that was just the way of things, that children grow, build lives of their own. But deep down in the ache he never voiced, he knew something else had taken root, distance, not miles, not time, but a colder kind of distance. Still, he tried to believe in his son. He told himself Edith would have wanted that. Don't give up on him, Merle, he could almost hear her whisper. He's still our boy, so he waited. He cooked too much food for one. He checked the mailbox twice a day. He left the porch light on longer than needed, hoping one evening he'd see headlights turn into the driveway. But more often than not, the nights passed quietly. Just him, the creak of his rocking chair, and the hum of an old furnace fighting the cold. And then on a particularly sharp December evening, he heard it, the crunch of tires on the frozen driveway. Slam of a car door, footsteps hurried, heavy, coming up the walk. Merle gripped the arm of his rocking chair. His heart, fragile and worn, thudded against his ribs. Were they here to visit, to share a meal? Or he swallowed, eyes darting toward Edith's photo on the mantel. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel empty. It felt like it was holding its breath. And Merle, alone in the drafty living room, suddenly realized this visit was not going to be like the others. Garrett Ferris had once been the center of Merle's world. Merle could still remember the way the boy's small hands had gripped his calloused fingers, how his eyes lit up when Merle showed him how to swing a hammer or catch a line drive in the backyard. Back then, G thought his father was the strongest man alive, able to climb telephone poles in lightning storms, able to fix anything broken with a wrench and a little patience. But boys don't stay boys, they grow, and sometimes, when they grow, they forget. Garrett went away to college, came back with a degree, and with him came Vera. She was polite enough, with a smile that could light up a room, but Merle never quite trusted the way her eyes lingered, on the house, on the car, on the few savings he had scraped together. Her compliments always felt rehearsed, as if she were trying on affection the way one tries on a coat in a department store, looking at the fit, the value, before deciding whether to keep it. At first, Merle tried to ignore it. He told himself that all young couples wanted more out of life, a nicer house, a better car, opportunities he and Edith had never dreamed of. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, G himself began to change. The visits grew shorter, the laughter thinner. Conversations that once stretched late into the night now barely lasted a quarter of an hour. Garrett's hands, once scraped and dirty from helping his father, were now soft, manicured. Uncalloused, he worked in supply management at a construction company, but Merle couldn't remember the last time his son had picked up a tool. "Dad, you worry too much," G would say, waving off Merle's concerns about bills or repairs. "Times are different now, things are easier." Easier, that word tasted bitter to Merle. He had built a life out of hard climbs, hard winters, hard choices. Easy felt like betrayal to everything he'd taught his son. Still, Merle held his tongue. He told himself Edith would want peace, not conflict. He reminded himself that love meant forgiving the small things. He kept hoping that G would come back to him, not in miles, but in heart. But each visit left Merle colder than before. And then there were the questions, subtle at first, always wrapped in concern. "How's your heart, Dad? Have you thought about what would happen if you couldn't live here alone anymore? You know, there are some great nursing homes now. They take care of everything." Vera's smile never reached her eyes when she asked. G's voice always seemed just a little too eager. Merle brushed it off at first, told himself it was just love twisted into worry. But deep down, in the place a father doesn't want to admit, he felt something else creeping in, suspicion. Because when G looked at him now, Merle no longer saw the boy who once clapped at his father's strength. He saw a man measuring, calculating, as if trying to decide not what his father was worth as a man, but what his house was worth as an asset. That night, long after they left, Merle sat alone in his rocking chair. The draft whispered through the curtains, and Edith's photo seemed to watch him from the mantel. He whispered to her as if she could hear, "Something's changed, Eddie. He doesn't look at me the way he used to." And in the stillness of that cold December night, a thought he wished he could ignore lodged itself in his chest, heavier than the failing valve of his heart. Maybe my own son wasn't just drifting away, maybe he was planning something. A man can work his whole life to make his body strong, but time always wins in the end. Merle had always thought of himself as sturdy. He'd climbed poles in snowstorms, hauled heavy cables through rain, stood balanced against winds that could topple trees. But lately his chest ached in ways he couldn't ignore. His breath grew shorter after just a few steps. His fingers, once steady as iron, trembled when he held his morning coffee. It was the doctor. Brady who finally told him the truth. "The valve is failing, Merle. You can ignore it, but you know what that means. One attack and it could be your last." Merle sat in silence that day, staring at the wall. He had survived storms that leveled neighborhoods, but he couldn't outclimb the storm inside his own chest. He remembered the hospital where Edith had gone in smiling, promising she'd be home by the weekend. She never came back since then. The very smell of antiseptic carried a ghost. The thought of dying in a white room, machines beeping, no hand to hold, it chilled him more than any winter draft ever could. At night, alone in his rocking chair, he confessed his fears only to Edith's photo. "I don't want to go in there, Eddie. I don't want to end up like you, cold, zipped in a bag, leaving G to sign the papers." The loneliness wrapped tighter. Age doesn't just take your strength, it takes your courage, too. And yet somewhere inside, Merle knew he couldn't outrun this. The pain was sharper now, the warning louder. He began to wonder if this was how it ended, not with dignity, but with tubes and silence. When G and Vera came by, their concern was immediate, almost too immediate. "Dad, you can't keep delaying this," Garrett insisted, his tone somewhere between worried son and impatient manager. Vera leaned in, her eyes soft, her words smoother still. "You'll be fine, Merle. Medicine is a miracle these days, but you need the operation, and while you're gone, don't worry about the house. We'll handle everything." Merle forced a smile, but his stomach turned. The house, always the house. It wasn't just his chest that ached that evening. It was the gnawing question, were they worried about him or about what would be left behind if he didn't come back? Later that night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he felt a flutter in his chest that made him clutch the sheets in panic. It passed after a moment, leaving him drenched in sweat, gasping in the dark. For the first time, Merle admitted to himself he was scared, truly scared, not just of death, but of what might happen to everything he had built if he weren't there to guard it. And the thought struck him with cruel clarity. If his heart failed in the hospital, who would stand watch over the house? For the first time in months, Garrett and Vera showed up smiling, too smiling. They breezed into the living room with the sort of cheerfulness that felt rehearsed. Vera carried a basket of fruit, polished apples and oranges stacked so neatly it might have come from a magazine. Garrett set down a box of pastries from the River Lodge, the good kind, he said, though his father noticed he hadn't baked them, just bought them on the way. "Dad, how are you feeling?" Garrett asked. Voice overly warm, like someone trying to sell insurance. "You're looking strong," Vera added, slipping off her leather gloves, her diamond ring catching the light. "You really shouldn't push yourself, though. You ought to let people take care of you." Merle sat back in his rocking chair, pulling the old quilt tighter around his shoulders. Something in their tone rubbed against him. It wasn't that they were unkind. On the surface, every word was wrapped in care, but beneath it he sensed something else. Eagerness, urgency. They asked about his health, of course. About his heart, his medication, his next appointment, but the questions shifted slowly, almost artfully, into other matters. "Dad, you've really got to think about what would happen if things went bad in the hospital," Garrett said carefully, his hands folded, his eyes avoiding his father's. "Not that we want that," Vera jumped in quickly, "but it's just responsible. You have to be practical at your age. You wouldn't want us scrambling with bills or papers if something happened." Merle's eyes narrowed. He studied them as they spoke, weighing each word. It wasn't the concern that bothered him, it was how easily they kept circling back to the house. "Don't worry, Dad," Garrett continued. "I'll come by every day while you're in the hospital, check the heat, pick up the mail, keep everything in order." "Yes," Vera nodded eagerly. And it might be a good idea to make sure all your important documents are, well, easy to find, just in case the doctors need anything. Power of attorney, titles, deeds. The word hung in the air like a spark from a downed wire. Deeds. Merle shifted uncomfortably. All that's taken care of, he muttered. I've got a folder for the important things, nothing you need to worry about. But Vera's smile tightened, the kind that never reached her eyes. Of course, still. It's always wise to review. Laws change, you know. Sometimes signatures expire. Don't you think, Garrett? Her husband nodded quickly, almost too quickly. Merle's chest tightened, not from his failing valve this time, but from something colder, suspicion turning into certainty. For years he had convinced himself their distance was just life pulling them away. But in that moment, staring at their eager smiles, he realized something far more unsettling. They weren't circling him out of love. They were circling like hawks, waiting for the right moment to swoop. That night. After they left with their untouched fruit basket and polite goodbyes, Merle sat alone in the silence of the house he had built. The old quilt slipped from his shoulders, forgotten. On the kitchen table lay his teacup, half-finished, and next to it a folded piece of paper Vera had left behind deliberately or perhaps by accident. Merle picked it up. His hands trembled as he read the words printed at the top. Durable power of attorney draft copy. The paper slid from his fingers, landing silently on the table. The house groaned in the winter wind, as if it too understood what this meant. The paper sat on the table long after Garrett and Vera left, its words staring back at Merle like an accusation. Durable power of attorney draft copy. He hadn't seen one of those in years. The last time had been 3 winters ago, after he'd fallen off a pole and cracked his back. His doctor insisted he prepare documents just in case decisions had to be made while he was laid up. He remembered sitting in the office of a young notary, signing his name carefully. Feeling embarrassed that such precautions were even necessary. It was meant only for medical choices, temporary, a safeguard, not for this. Merle rubbed the bridge of his nose, his breath fogging in the cold kitchen. Was it possible his son had kept that memory alive, waiting for the day when it could be turned into something else? The next afternoon, Garrett arrived alone. No fruit basket, no pastries, just him, wearing a new coat Merle hadn't seen before. His son didn't knock, he never did, but walked straight in, brushing snow from his shoulders. "Dad," Garrett said, his voice softer than usual, almost careful. "I've been thinking, when you go in for surgery next week, we should really update the paperwork. You know, the power of attorney, it's just smart. Doctors sometimes need quick decisions, and if something goes wrong, well..." He let the sentence trail off, letting the weight of silence finish it for him. Merle's chest tightened. "I already have one," he muttered. "Signed it years ago." Garrett nodded quickly, almost too quickly. "Yeah, but those things expire, Dad. You know how the law works. Better safe than sorry. We wouldn't want any confusion at the hospital." He said the words with practiced ease, but Merle heard the false notes in the melody. His son wasn't asking, he was maneuvering. Besides, Garrett added, lowering his voice, "it would help Vera and me if we had everything ready. You don't want to leave us scrambling, do you?" There it was again, the casual use of us. Not you, not your health, but us. Merle studied his son. The same chin he once kissed goodnight. The same eyes that once lit up at the sight of a baseball glove. Now those eyes were different, calculating, restless. Something inside Merle broke a little that moment. A father wants to believe in his child's goodness until the very end. But what he saw in Garrett's eyes wasn't love, it was need. A desperate hunger dressed up as responsibility. "I'll think about it," Merle said finally, his voice flat. Garrett smiled, relieved, too relieved. "That's all I ask, just think about it." He patted his father's shoulder as if sealing a deal, then walked out, leaving a trail of melting snow on the rug. Merle stayed seated long after, staring at the door. He whispered to Edith's photo on the mantel, his voice cracked and weary. "He's not just worried, Eddie, he's planning." Later that night, as he shuffled into the bedroom, Merle opened the drawer of his old oak desk. From beneath a stack of unpaid bills, he pulled out a battered leather folder. Inside were the documents that mattered, the deed to the house, insurance papers, the very power of attorney Garrett had mentioned. He flipped through the yellowing pages, his finger tracing his own shaky signature. His heart pounded harder the deeper he read, and then he saw it plain as day. Expiration date, November 10, 2023. Expired. A month ago, the realization struck like a blow. His son had known, he had waited. Merle's hand shook as he slid the folder shut. Upstairs, the old furnace groaned, rattling through the silence of the house. And for the first time, the place he'd built with his own two hands no longer felt like shelter. It felt like a trap. The morning of his admission arrived colder than usual. Blackfoot lay under a thin veil of frost, every rooftop shining pale blue in the dim December light. Merle rose before dawn, sitting at the edge of his bed, his chest heavy, not only with the valve that betrayed him, but with the gnawing unease that had been growing since Garrett's last visit. He had never been away from this house for more than a few nights. The idea of leaving it alone for weeks while he was under anesthesia. Tubes in his veins left him unsettled in a way that went beyond words. He shuffled through the rooms slowly, as if committing every creak and shadow to memory. His hand lingered on the stair railing worn smooth by Edith's touch, on the chipped corner of the kitchen counter where G had once dropped a toy truck. Packing was simple, a few shirts, socks, the detective novel he had barely started. The real packing was happening in his mind, tucking away memories. Whispering promises to the house he had built with his own two hands. Stay strong while I'm gone. Don't let them take you from me. At precisely 9 o'clock, Garrett pulled into the driveway. The new Ford's engine purred, too polished for the icy streets. He came inside with unusual energy, his coat unbuttoned, his hair too neatly combed, as though he were preparing for more than just a hospital drop-off. "Morning, Dad," he said too loudly, setting down his father's suitcase before Merle even had the chance to reach for it. "I'll take care of everything while you're gone. Don't worry about a thing. Heat, mail, bills, consider it done." His words tumbled out quickly, each one meant to reassure, but together they felt rehearsed, like a salesman closing in on a deal. Merle gave a slow nod, wrapping his scarf tighter around his neck. "I'll hold you to it." Garrett clapped his father's shoulder with an almost cheerful force. Of course, family takes care of each other. That line, "family takes care of each other," should have warmed him, but instead it felt like ice sliding down his spine. As Garrett busied himself by checking the thermostat, the mailbox, the locks on the doors, Merle stood silently watching. His son's movements were too deliberate, his eyes scanning the place not with affection but with calculation, as though he were already taking inventory of what was his. On the ride to the hospital, the silence between them was heavy. Garrett filled it with talk about his job, about Vera's plans, about how this surgery would give Dad a whole new lease on life. Merle stared out the window at the bare fields rolling past, his thoughts elsewhere. When they reached the hospital, Garrett parked quickly, sprang out, and rushed to help his father. Too quick, too eager. Inside, as the nurses checked him in, Garrett stepped forward each time, answering questions that weren't directed at him, filling out forms without being asked. At one point, when the receptionist slid a clipboard toward Merle, Garrett's hand twitched as though to grab it first. Merle gently pulled it back, his eyes narrowing. "I can still sign my own name." For a moment their eyes met. Garrett smiled, but the smile was thin, strained. Once the paperwork was done, a nurse wheeled Merle toward the elevators. Garrett walked beside them, chattering about how he'd stop by the house later. "Maybe bring Vera to check on things. You just focus on your health, Dad. Leave the rest to us." Merle's grip tightened on the armrest of the wheelchair. "Us, always us." As the elevator doors slid shut, Garrett gave a small wave. The last thing Merle saw before the steel doors closed was his son's face, smiling but with eyes that darted, calculating. And in that brief, narrowing frame of vision, a thought hit him harder than the chest pain ever could. "If I don't come back from this hospital, the house is already his." Hospitals have their own kind of silence. It is not the peace of a quiet home, nor the hush of a church. It is a silence interrupted by the steady beep of monitors, the shuffle of nurses' shoes, the distant coughs of other patients. It is a silence that reminds you every second of how fragile you are. Merle lay in the narrow bed of St. Luke's, the sheets crisp, the air sharp with disinfectant. His chest ached from the incision. But what pressed heavier was not the pain, it was the stillness beside him. A chair sat empty in the corner, the way Edith would have filled it, the way Garrett should have filled it. On the second evening, as the nurse dimmed the lights, Merle reached for the phone on the tray table. He dialed Garrett's number. One ring, two, then voicemail. "Gar, it's Dad," he said softly, his voice rough. "Just wanted to hear from you. Let me know how the house is holding up, and I'd like to see you." He set the phone down, waiting. No reply. The next morning, after his vitals were checked and his breakfast tray cleared, he tried again. Same result, straight to voicemail. He left another message, forcing brightness into his tone this time. Son, no rush, just wanted to talk. The doctors say I'm doing all right. Call when you can. Hours passed. The phone stayed silent. By the third day, Merle's patience thinned into worry. He left a third message, shorter, sharper. Garrett, are you there? I thought you said you'd stop by. Still nothing. At night, Merle dreamed of Edith standing in the yard under the maple tree, her hand lifted in a wave. You've always been too trusting, Merle, she whispered in the dream. He woke with his heart pounding, the sheets damp with sweat. The next afternoon, he called Vera's phone. No answer. He tried their home line. An automated voice told him the number was temporarily unavailable. The silence now felt louder than any hospital monitor. It was not the silence of distance, but the silence of avoidance. He stared at the ceiling, his mind circling back to the hurried way Garrett had filled out forms at admission, to Vera's smooth talk about making documents easy to find. A cold suspicion seeped deeper into him. Their absence wasn't neglect, it was opportunity. On the fourth day, as snow began to fall outside the hospital window, Merle reached for the phone again. His hand trembled, not from weakness, but from dread. This time he didn't call his son, he called home. The line rang and rang until finally the machine picked up. His own voice echoed back at him, recorded years ago. This is the Ferris residence. Leave a message. Merle hung up slowly. The house was silent too, and in that silence he felt it, an unshakable certainty that something inside those walls was no longer his. The morning of the surgery came cloaked in a stillness that felt heavier than any storm Merle had ever worked through. Nurses moved briskly around him, their voices hushed but efficient, clipping monitors to his chest, checking the Roman IV drip, adjusting the thin hospital gown that left him colder than he already was. He tried to steady his breathing, but each inhale reminded him of how fragile his chest had become. Dr. Chen, a woman with clear, steady eyes, leaned down and smiled gently. Mr. Ferris, this is routine. We do these procedures every week. You'll be fine. Merle nodded, but the reassurance barely touched him. Routine, she said, for her maybe. For him, this was the narrow bridge between living and never walking back into the house he had built with his hands. He thought of Edith then, of how she had walked into a hospital years ago, laughing, promising she'd be home soon. She hadn't been. He remembered standing by a casket, his fingers numb, wondering how life could turn so suddenly on a word like routine. As they wheeled him down the corridor, the fluorescent lights passing overhead in slow, sterile rhythm, he whispered under his breath, "Eddie, if you're there, don't let me go yet." In the operating room, the air was sharp with antiseptic. Machines beeped steadily. A mask hovered above his face, the sweet smell of anesthesia seeping closer. "Doctor." Chen's voice floated to him, "Take care of waking up, Mr. Ferris, deal." He tried to answer, but his throat caught. His last thought before the darkness swallowed him wasn't of his own heart, it was of the house, the maple tree in the yard, the rocking chair by the window, and the gnawing suspicion that, as he lay helpless on this table, his son was already moving pieces in a game he hadn't agreed to play. The world narrowed, the mask pressed closer, his eyes closed. Silence. And when he woke, hours later, the light above him blurred into shape. His chest burned, his throat was raw, his body heavy as stone. He heard the steady beep of the monitor. He was alive. A nurse leaned over him with a freckled smile. "Welcome back, Mr. Ferris. Surgery was a success. You're on the road to recovery." Alive, he should have felt relief, gratitude, but what he felt instead was dread, because as he lay there, groggy and aching, he realized something more terrifying than death itself. He had survived the knife. But what if, in those same hours, he had lost his home? Discharge day came with the smell of snow in the air. The nurse wheeled Merle out through the sliding glass doors of St. Luke's, his suitcase balanced on his knees, the December wind cutting sharp against his cheeks. He had survived. The valve in his chest was repaired, his pulse steady, his breath a little easier. Yet relief was not what he felt. What filled him instead was a restless urgency. Get back to the house. Mrs. Pringle, his near-blind neighbor with the old Chevy, had agreed to pick him up. The ride home was terrifying. Twice she nearly ran a red light, once she drifted across the center line, but Merle clutched the armrest and said nothing. Fear of the road was nothing compared to the fear gnawing at his heart. What would he find when he returned? When the Chevy finally rattled into his driveway, Merle exhaled, staring at the place he had built with his own hands. The maple tree stood bare against the winter sky, branches scratching at the gray clouds. The house looked the same, or so it seemed from the outside. "Thank you, Alice," he said quietly as she waved and drove off. Merle climbed the porch steps slowly, one hand gripping the railing. His breath caught when he reached for the door handle. The metal felt colder than usual, as if untouched for days. He turned the key and stepped inside. The air was wrong. The house greeted him not with warmth, but with a chill that sank into his bones. He checked the thermostat, 15 degrees, the lowest setting, just enough to keep pipes from freezing, but not enough to keep a man comfortable. So Garrett hadn't been coming by as promised. Merle's eyes swept the living room. Dust lingered on the mantel, the mail sat piled in the hallway. Even the teacup he had left on the kitchen table before surgery was still there. A ring of dried coffee clinging to the rim. No one had touched it. No one had touched anything. His chest tightened, not from the incision, but from the truth pressing in. His son had lied. Dragging his suitcase across the floor, Merle settled into the old rocking chair by the window. The quilt still lay where he had left it. The house creaked in familiar ways, but beneath it all was a silence that felt heavier than before, as though the house itself knew it had been abandoned. He told himself maybe Garrett had been busy, maybe work had kept him away, but the evidence screamed otherwise. The empty mailbox, the cold thermostat, the stillness of rooms untouched for weeks. As the winter light faded, Merle forced himself up, shuffling toward the hallway where the unopened stack of letters waited. He sorted them slowly, utility bills, insurance notices, Christmas advertisements. Then his hand froze on one envelope. The return address read, Baker, Stone and Associates Attorneys at Law. Heart pounding, Merle tore it open. His eyes scanned the words once, then again, until they blurred. Notice of property transfer. Effective December 15th. Owner of record, Garrett and Vera Ferris. The room spun. He clutched the table for balance. His breath came ragged, the stitches in his chest burning. The house he had built nail by nail, the house where Edith had laughed, where Garrett had grown, was no longer his. His hand shook as he reached for the phone on the wall. He dialed Garrett's number. Ring, ring, voicemail. He tried again and again. Silence. At last, he slammed the receiver back into place. His gaze drifted to Edith's photo on the mantel. Her eyes, frozen in a smile, seemed to ask a question he couldn't bear to answer. "Eddie," he whispered, his voice breaking, "what have we raised?" Outside, the wind howled through the bare branches of the maple tree, rattling the window panes like fingers tapping from the dark. And in that moment, Merle knew the truth. His worst fear had come to pass. His son hadn't just neglected the house, he had taken it. The envelope lay flat on the kitchen table, its black print glaring against the yellow light of the single lamp. Merle sat hunched over it, his hands trembling, not from age this time, but from the storm rising inside him. Notice of property transfer. The words were sharp enough to cut through bone. He forced his eyes lower, scanning line by line. Seller of record, Garrett Ferris, acting on behalf of Merle Ferris. Buyer of record, Garrett and Vera Ferris. Transaction date, December 15th. The room seemed to tilt. His chest tightened, but he pushed aside the pain. He read the words again, slower this time, hoping they would change, hoping it was some mistake of ink or bureaucracy. They didn't. His son hadn't just lied. He hadn't just neglected. He had sold the house to himself. Merle's fingers dug into the paper, crumpling the edge. "God help me," he whispered, his voice raw. He used my name. He staggered to his desk, pulling open the bottom drawer where the old leather folder lay. Inside, beneath bills and faded photographs, he found it, the worn document he had signed years ago after the fall from the pole, durable power of attorney. He flipped through the pages with shaking hands until he saw it, valid for 3 years from date of issuance, limited to medical decisions and related financial matters. Date of issue, November 10th, 2020. Expired November 10th, 2023. Expired. His son had taken a paper that was no longer living, no longer valid, and wielded it like a weapon. The fury hit him then, not the hot, reckless anger of youth, but the cold, steady rage of a man betrayed at the deepest root. His breath came slow, his jaw tight, his eyes unblinking on the page. It wasn't just theft, it was a betrayal wrapped in signatures, a fraud carried out in broad daylight. Hidden under the cloak of family trust, Merle rose from the chair, pacing the room. The walls seemed to close in on him, every nail, every beam whispering of the hours he had spent building them. 40 years of sweat and sacrifice, reduced to paperwork signed behind his back. He looked at Edith's picture on the mantel. For years he had spoken to her photo in loneliness. Tonight he spoke to her in rage. "You told me not to give up on him, Eddie. You told me he was still our boy, but look at him now. Look at what he's done." The photo, of course, didn't answer, but in the silence, Merle felt his anger crystallize into something harder, sharper: resolve. Hands steadied as he gathered the papers, the expired power of attorney, the transfer notice, the evidence of betrayal. He stacked them neatly on the desk, the way a soldier lays out his weapons. For the first time since the surgery, he felt stronger, not healed, not whole, but alive with purpose. Garrett thought his father was a frail old man, a man too weak to fight back, a man who would accept betrayal because blood demanded forgiveness. But Garrett had forgotten who raised him. Merle Ferris had spent 39 years climbing poles in storms that would break lesser men. He had survived lightning, blizzards, and the aching loneliness of a house too quiet without Edith. He would survive this too. He lowered himself into the rocking chair, pulled a notebook toward him, and uncapped a pen. On the first line, he wrote one word in shaky but determined script: plan. As the wind rattled the maple branches against the window, Merle began to write, tomorrow. He promised himself the fight would begin. The Christmas tree in the corner still twinkled with colored lights, though no one had gathered around it. Merle had decorated it out of habit in early December, a ritual Edith had always loved. Every year she would hum carols while stringing popcorn garlands, laughing when Garrett, just a boy then, ate more kernels than he strung. Now the ornaments dangled in silence, a reminder of traditions that no longer belonged to anyone but him. On Christmas Eve, Merle sat in his rocking chair, quilt pulled to his chin, the smell of pine faint in the room. The house was quiet but not peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that pressed on your chest until you felt smaller. He tried to distract himself with the detective novel he had brought from the hospital, but the words blurred together. His thoughts circled the same question: why hadn't Garrett answered my calls? The answer arrived the next morning. His phone buzzed on the table beside his chair. A message from Garrett. Merle reached for it eagerly, a small spark of hope warming him that maybe, just maybe, his son was finally checking in to wish him a Merry Christmas. He opened the message, only one line: "Your house is sold. I left with my wife. Bye." The words cut deeper than any surgeon's scalpel. For a long moment, Merle simply stared at the glowing screen, his brain refusing to process what his eyes read. He blinked, rubbed his face, read it again. The words didn't change. The house, his house, gone, and with it the last thread that tethered him to the belief that family meant safety. His chest ached, but not from the stitches. This was a wound no medicine could treat. He thought he would crumble under it, collapse, weep, curse the heavens. Instead, something unexpected rose inside him. Cold, clear rage. It steadied his hands, sharpened his thoughts. It was the kind of fury that burned clean, leaving no room for confusion or excuses. Garrett hadn't just stolen his house. He had mocked him in the process, reducing 4 decades of labor and love to a text message with the cruel finality of the word bye. Merle set the phone down slowly, deliberately, as though it might burn his hand. He looked at the Christmas tree, its lights flashing red and green across the window. The colors blurred into something menacing. He whispered into the room, his voice low. "Steady, so that's how it is, son. You've declared war." He rose from the rocking chair, pain tugging at the incision in his chest, but he ignored it. He crossed to the desk, pulled out the folder of documents he had stacked the night before. He spread them across the surface like evidence in a trial: expired power of attorney, notice of property transfer, proof. The maple branches scraped the window outside like bony fingers reminding him of the stakes. This wasn't just about a house, it was about respect, about betrayal, about blood turning against blood. Merle pressed both palms flat on the desk, leaning over the papers. His heart hammered, but his mind was clear. "This won't end here," he muttered. "Not with a text, not with bye." In that moment, the grief of an old man gave way to the resolve of a father wronged. Christmas Day had always been about family, about giving, about forgiveness. But that year, for Merle Ferris, Christmas became something else entirely. The day of betrayal carved him open, and the day he chose to fight back. The morning after Christmas broke clear and bitter cold. The snow along Maple Street crunched under Merle's boots as he made his way to the old pickup truck. Every breath was a cloud, every step a reminder of the stitches in his chest, but pain no longer slowed him. The rage inside him pushed him forward like a furnace. He knew where he had to go. Quentin Weed. They'd gone to high school together back in Blackfoot. Quentin had been the clever one. The kind of boy who always knew how to twist a teacher's question into his own advantage. Merle had taken the practical path, linesman, steady paycheck, build a house with his own two hands. Quentin had taken another, law school. He made a career of it, built a name for himself in the county courthouse, and eventually retired with a comfortable home on Oak Street. Merle hadn't spoken to him in years, but there are some friends you can knock on after decades. And the bond is still there. Quentin's house loomed tall and Victorian, a sharp contrast to Merle's plain built on oak and maple. A Lexus sat in the driveway, gleaming even under the frost. Merle parked his dented pickup beside it, the two vehicles like mirror images of their owners, one polished, one worn, both still running. When Quentin opened the door, he squinted for a moment, then his face softened into recognition. "Merle Ferris," he said. His voice raspier with age, but still carrying authority. "Well, I'll be damned, haven't seen you since," he trailed off, eyes narrowing at the weariness in Merle's face. "Come in, whatever brought you here isn't small." Inside, Quentin's office smelled of leather and old books. Shelves towered with volumes of case law, their spines cracked from years of battles fought. A silver coffee pot steamed on the desk. Merle sat, his hands heavy on his knees. For a moment he said nothing, staring at the grain of the oak desk, steadying his voice. Then he began. He told it all, the surgery, the silence, the letter from Baker, Stone and Associates, and finally the text, "Your house is sold, I left with my wife." When he finished, Quentin leaned back, eyes narrowed, fingers steepled under his chin. He didn't speak right away. Lawyers never did. They let silence weigh the words. Finally, he reached for the papers Merle had carried in his folder. He scanned the expired power of attorney, muttering under his breath, his brow furrowed deeper as he flipped to the notice of transfer. "Jesus, Merle," he said softly. "They used this expired thing." He tapped the paper with a sharp finger. "This doesn't authorize real estate transactions even when it was valid, and it expired last month. The sale doesn't just smell wrong, it is wrong." Hope flickered inside Merle's chest, tentative but real. "So I can get the house back." Quentin's mouth tightened. "Maybe, but it won't be simple. They've already moved fast, titled it in their names, probably took out a loan against it. We'll need to challenge the sale in civil court. Fraud, forgery, abuse of power of attorney." Merle's jaw clenched. "I want justice. I want my house back." Quentin leaned forward, his eyes sharp, almost predatory. "Then you came to the right man. I may be retired, but I still know people at the registry office, judges, clerks, and I'll tell you this, if your son thinks he can walk away with your life's work, he's in for a surprise." Merle sat back, exhaling, the weight on his chest lightening, not from surgery but from resolve. For the first time since Edith's passing, since Garrett's betrayal, he didn't feel like a helpless old man. He felt like a man with a weapon again, not a hammer or a wrench, but the law. Quentin poured him a cup of coffee and slid it across the desk. "This won't be quick," he said. "It'll take filings, hearings, maybe months. But Merle," he paused, his voice softer now, "I've seen men broken by less. If you want to do this, you've got to be ready to carry the fight all the way." Merle gripped the warm mug with both hands. He thought of Edith, of the maple tree, of the house that had sheltered a lifetime. Then he thought of the text. He looked Quentin square in the eye. "I've carried heavier loads my whole life. I'm ready." Quentin nodded slowly, a faint smile curling. "Then let's make them regret underestimating you." And in that quiet Victorian office, amid shelves of dusty law books, the plan for Merle's counterattack was born. Quentin Weed never did anything halfway. When Merle left his office that night, Quentin promised, "Give me 2 days." And when Quentin made a promise, it meant he was already pulling strings. 2 days later, Merle's phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice was not. "Merle, it's Quentin. Come to my house. We've got something." Merle drove the old pickup down Oak Street, his breath fogging against the windshield. His heart thudded. Not just from the healing stitches, but from anticipation. He had been waiting for proof, something concrete to turn his rage into action. When Quentin opened the door, he wasn't alone. A woman sat in the office beside him, short, sharp-eyed, with folders stacked neatly at her side. "This is Brenda Martinez," Quentin said. "Civil litigation, still practicing. I thought you might need someone who knows the courtroom floor better than I do these days." Brenda gave Merle a brisk nod, then slid a document across the desk. "This is what we found at the county registry." Merle leaned forward, his breath catching as his eyes scanned the paper. Property transfer contract December 15th. Seller Garrett Ferris acting under power of attorney. Buyer Garrett and Vera Ferris. Sale price $120,000. Merle's hand shook. 120. This house is worth double that. 200,000 easily, Brenda confirmed. The county's own assessment pegs it higher. He undercut the value so it would slide through quickly, avoiding extra scrutiny. Quentin tapped the document with one long finger. Here's the real kicker. The day after this so-called sale, Garrett and Vera went straight to the bank, took out a loan of $100,000 using the house as collateral. Half of that wired immediately to Bermuda Dreams Travel Agency. He pulled out another paper, a bank statement highlighted in yellow, $50,000 on a luxury vacation. The other 50 dropped into their mortgage account, just enough to keep their over-leveraged lifestyle afloat. Merle stared at the numbers, his jaw tightening. It wasn't just betrayal anymore, it was strategy. Cold, calculated theft disguised as family duty. His own son had sold his house to himself, stripped it for cash, and then used the stolen equity to sip cocktails on a beach. He pressed his palms to the desk, his voice low but steady. He knew exactly what he was doing. Brenda leaned in, her tone sharp, professional. Yes, and that's fraud, abuse of power of attorney. Possibly even grand larceny, depending on how the court reads it. You have a strong case. But here's what I need to know, Mr. Ferris. Are you ready for this to go public? Because once we file, your son will face criminal exposure. Jail time. This won't be just a family matter anymore. For a moment, Merle felt the old ache in his chest, the father in him wanting to protect the boy he had raised, the boy who once clung to his hand. But then the text echoed in his mind, your house is sold. I left with my wife. Bye. His eyes hardened. I didn't ask for this fight, but I'm damn sure going to finish it. Quentin and Brenda exchanged a glance, both nodding. Quentin's smile carried that old cunning edge Merle remembered from high school debates. Good, Quentin said, because I've already set the wheels in motion. The registrar is ready to flag the sale. The police will open an inquiry. And tomorrow, Garrett and Vera will come home from their little paradise in Bermuda. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing like a predator about to strike. We'll be waiting. Merle sat in silence, his fists clenched on his knees. For the first time since Edith's death, since the betrayal of his only son, he felt something different from grief. He felt purpose. But just as he rose to leave, Brenda slid one last paper across the desk. One more thing you should know. Merle frowned, scanning the note. His heart sank. It wasn't just his house. Garrett had listed Merle himself, his health records, his pension benefits, even his insurance policies as attached references on the financial paperwork. His son hadn't just stolen his home. He had used his father's very life as collateral. Merle's chest went cold, and in that chilling moment he realized this wasn't just greed. This was a man willing to gamble with his father's life to keep his own afloat. The papers lay spread across Quentin's oak desk like the pieces of a crime scene. Contracts, bank transfers, the expired power of attorney. Every sheet was proof, every line a nail in Garrett's coffin. Merle sat in silence, his rough hands folded on his lap, his chest rising and falling with the heavy breath of a man holding his fury inside. He wasn't used to this world of legal language and financial games, but he understood betrayal. He understood work, sacrifice, loyalty, and what it felt like when someone spat on all three. Quentin poured another cup of coffee, his voice calm but sharp. They land tomorrow evening. Bermuda flight 19:30 arrival. They'll drive straight home, tired, thinking they got away with everything. That's when we strike. Merle lifted his eyes. Strike how? Brenda Martinez leaned forward, tapping her pen on the bank statement. We're filing both civil and criminal actions tomorrow morning. Fraud, abuse of authority, property misrepresentation. By the time Garrett sets foot back in Blackfoot, there will already be a case number in the system. And Merle pressed, and Brenda continued, her eyes narrowing. We confront them directly, with police present. We show them the evidence, lay out the consequences. If they cooperate, return the house, sign restitution, avoid trial, we settle. If they resist, we push for full prosecution, jail, fines. Reputation in shreds. Merle's jaw tightened. The word jail made his stomach twist. A father's heart never stopped being a father's heart, no matter how blackened the child's choices. But then the memory of that text returned, cutting through his hesitation like broken glass. "Your house is sold. I left with my wife. Bye." "They won't walk free," Merle said firmly. "Not after that." Quentin gave a slow nod, satisfied. "Good, then here's how it works. Tomorrow night we'll be parked on the corner of Lynan Avenue across from their house. I've already spoken with Officer Ezra Singh. Remember him? You once gave him a place to stay when he was going through his divorce. He owes you. He'll be there with a young officer in training. Everything legal, everything official." Merle's eyes softened at the memory. Ezra Singh, the broken man he'd once offered his guest room to, no questions asked. Funny how life circles back. Brenda's voice broke through his thoughts. "I want you prepared, Mr. Ferris. This won't be easy. Seeing your son face to face, laying this out, it will hurt. He'll beg, deny, maybe even attack you with words meant to wound, but you must stay calm. Let the law speak. The moment you lose your temper, they win." Merle nodded slowly. Calm, cold, ice over fire. He could do that. He had climbed poles in blizzards with lightning cracking around him. He could face his own son with steady hands. That night back in his cold house, Merle sat at the desk with the rocking chair creaking beneath him. The maple branches outside tapped against the window like a warning. He opened his notebook again and wrote in block letters, "Tomorrow 9 a.m., file lawsuit, police report with Ezra, confrontation at 9 p.m. He stared at the words for a long time, then tore out the page and tucked it into the pocket of his flannel shirt as though carrying it close would give him strength. Before bed, he paused in front of Edith's picture, her smile frozen in time. "Look softer tonight," almost approving. "Tomorrow, Eddie," he whispered. "Tomorrow he learns a man's legacy isn't for stealing, not from me, not from you." The house groaned under the winter wind, but Merle didn't shiver this time. For the first time in weeks, he felt ready. The trap was set, and tomorrow Garrett would walk straight into it. The night of December 27th was clear and cruelly cold. The stars hung like shards of ice above Blackfoot, and every breath seemed to cut the lungs. Merle sat in the passenger seat of Officer Ezra Singh's patrol car, parked beneath the shadow of bare maple trees on Lynan Avenue. Beside him, Ezra's presence was steady, his dark eyes reflecting years of hard cases and harder choices. In the back seat, young Officer Brett Hines shifted nervously, tapping his knee in restless rhythm. Behind them, another car sat quiet, Quentin and Brenda waiting, their silhouettes lit faintly by the glow of paperwork spread across the dash. The trap was ready. All they needed now was Garrett. Merle's hands tightened around the notebook in his lap. The page he'd written last night, file lawsuit, police report, confrontation, was creased from being folded and unfolded too many times. He ran his thumb over the words as though they were scripture, anchoring him against the storm that threatened to break loose inside his chest. Ezra glanced at him. "You holding up?" Merle's jaw flexed. "I've worked through ice storms, climbed poles with lightning chasing me. I can hold up." He hesitated, then added quieter, "I just don't know if I can hold steady when I see his face." Ezra nodded slowly. "You don't have to yell, Mr. Ferris. That's my job. You just have to be there, let the law speak." Merle looked out through the windshield at the house across the street, Garrett's big, beautiful house with the 2 columns, lit faintly by a motion sensor lamp. Snow lay untouched on the driveway except for the faint tire tracks of the cab that would arrive soon. The house was a monument to debts too big, dreams too expensive, and lies too heavy to carry. Inside his chest, Merle felt 2 things warring, the old ache of a father who remembered a boy with scraped knees and wide eyes, and the cold fury of a man betrayed by that boy grown greedy. Hours passed slowly. Time in a parked car has a way of stretching, every tick of the clock louder than the one before. Ezra answered a call on his radio. Brett dozed lightly, jerking awake at every sound. Quentin stepped out once to stretch, his breath a cloud under the streetlight. Merle never moved. He kept his eyes on the road, waiting for the headlights that would end this silence. Finally, just after 9 p.m., Brett stiffened in the back seat. "Car," he whispered. A yellow cab turned onto Lynan Avenue, its headlights carving long beams into the snow. It rolled to a slow stop in front of Garrett's house. The back doors opened. First Vera emerged, tanned from sun she hadn't earned, her suitcase wheels crunching in the snow. Then Garrett stepped out, paying the driver, laughing at something his wife said. He looked healthy, glowing, carefree, as though the world had given him a prize instead of a warning. Merle's throat tightened. There was his son. Not the boy he had raised, but the man who had stolen his home. Now, Brett whispered, leaning forward. Ezra held up a hand. Wait until they are inside, let them settle, then we knock. So they waited. Garrett and Vera dragged their luggage up the steps, unlocked the door, disappeared inside. Lights flickered on, warm, golden, mocking. Ezra turned to Merle. Ready? Merle's voice was steady, but his eyes burned. Let's finish this. The patrol car doors opened with a crunch of boots on snow. The air bit hard, but Merle didn't shiver. He walked with Ezra and Brett toward the porch, every step like a drum beat, every heartbeat louder than the last. Ezra reached the doorbell and pressed it. The chime echoed inside the house. Footsteps approached. The door swung open. Garrett stood framed in the warm light, suitcase still by the stairs, his smile freezing when he saw who stood outside. "Dad," he stammered. Merle's eyes locked on his son's, cold and unflinching. And in that breathless moment, father and son faced each other, not as family, but as accuser and accused. The warmth of Garrett's house spilled onto the porch, but it did nothing to thaw the frozen air between father and son. Garrett's tan from Bermuda hadn't faded yet. His smile faltered the second he saw the uniforms. "Dad, officers, what's going on?" Ezra Singh stepped forward, his tone professional, clipped. "Garrett Ferris, we need to speak with you and your wife regarding the sale of your father's property at 57 Oak Street." Behind Garrett, Vera appeared. Still in her travel jacket, a steaming mug of coffee in her hand. Her eyes flickered with alarm when she saw Merle standing there, flanked by police. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice sharp, defensive. "May we come in?" Ezra asked evenly. "This conversation is best had inside." Garrett hesitated, his hand tightening on the doorknob, but when Vera's eyes darted nervously toward him, he stepped aside. "Fine," he muttered. The group entered the living room. Merle lowered himself into an armchair near the fireplace, his quilted flannel pulled tight. He said nothing, his silence heavier than words. Quentin and Brenda took positions behind him like generals ready to command, their folders in hand. Ezra and young Officer Brett remained standing, forming a wall of authority. Ezra opened a notebook. "On December 15th, records show you sold the property at 57 Oak Street." He paused, looking directly at Garrett. "The seller of record is listed as Garrett Ferris, acting on behalf of Merle Ferris via power of attorney. The buyer is listed as Garrett and Vera Ferris. Do you confirm this is accurate?" Garrett swallowed hard, Adam's apple bobbing. "Yes, but it was legitimate. I had power of attorney." Ezra's brow lifted. This power of attorney. He held up a folded paper that Merle had carried into Quentin's office. He read aloud, "Authorization limited to medical matters. Valid 3 years from November 10, 2020. Expired November 10, 2023. The transfer was signed December 15th, a month after expiration." Silence fell heavy. Vera shifted, setting her coffee down with a clatter. "That's ridiculous. Garrett was authorized. It was all legal." "No, Mrs. Ferris," Brenda cut in smoothly, her lawyer's voice sharp as glass. "It was fraud. Your husband acted without valid authority, misrepresented his power, and transferred property to himself at nearly half market value." She slapped the second paper onto the coffee table, the transfer contract. $120,000 for a house worth over $200,000. Then she flipped another page, a $100,000 loan taken against the property. Half spent on a luxury vacation, the other half thrown into your mortgage, all documented. Ezra's eyes narrowed as he looked at Garrett. "That's not only fraud, that's grand larceny." Garrett's face had gone pale, his tan now a cruel contrast against the sweat forming at his temples. "Dad, he turned to Merle, who sat silently. Eyes fixed on him with a calm colder than any shout. "It wasn't like that. I thought the power still worked. You thought wrong," Ezra interrupted firmly. "And the law doesn't accept 'I thought' as an excuse." Vera's voice rose, shrill, desperate. "We were going to get the house anyway when she caught herself, but the damage was done. When I die," Merle finished for her, his voice hoarse but steady. "That's what you were waiting for, wasn't it?" "Not enough to wait, you had to hurry it along." Garrett flinched. "No, Dad, that's not." Ezra snapped his notebook shut. "Mr. and Mrs. Ferris, you'll report to the station tomorrow at 10 a.m. for a formal statement. In the meantime, you should consult legal counsel. You're facing civil invalidation and potential criminal charges. Here's your subpoena." He placed the folded paper on the table with deliberate weight. The silence that followed was suffocating. Merle leaned forward in his chair, his eyes boring into his son. You sold the house where you were born, where your mother died. You sold me. And you had the nerve to send me a message on Christmas Day. Bye. Garrett's lips trembled. Dad, please. Merle stood, his body still stiff from surgery, but his spirit unbroken. No, Garrett, it's too late for please. The law will speak now. I don't need to. He turned toward the door, every step heavy, final. Ezra and Brett followed, Quentin and Brenda gathering their papers. Behind him, Merle heard Vera collapse onto the couch, muttering curses under her breath. Garrett's voice broke through once more, cracked and desperate. Dad, we can fix this. Merle paused at the threshold but didn't turn back. His words were low, almost a whisper. You can't fix betrayal. Then he stepped into the cold night, the door closing behind him like the final gavel in a courtroom. The days after the confrontation were heavy with silence. The kind of silence that feels alive, creeping into the corners of the house, breathing down your neck when the phone doesn't ring. But the phone did ring. On the second morning, just as the winter sun cut a thin line across the maple branches outside, Merle's phone buzzed on the kitchen table. Garrett's number flashed on the screen. For a long moment, Merle just stared at it, his hand hovering. Every instinct screamed to let it ring out, but blood ties have a way of pulling, even when they've been poisoned. He picked up. Dad, Garrett's voice came fast, frantic, the voice of a man cornered. Please, don't let them take this to trial. We can fix this. I made a mistake. I admit it. Merle said nothing, his silence heavier than words. I just thought, Garrett continued, I thought the power of attorney was still valid. I swear I didn't mean to trick you. I was desperate, Dad. The mortgage, the bills, Vera kept saying we were drowning. I only meant to keep us afloat. The house, it was always going to be mine someday. I just took it sooner. Merle closed his eyes, the ache in his chest sharper than any scalpel. The excuses were worse than the theft. You sent me a message, Merle finally said, his voice low, gravelly. On Christmas, your house is sold. I left with my wife. Bye. That wasn't desperation, Garrett. That was cruelty. On the other end, Garrett stammered. I was angry. I didn't mean it like that. I was drunk, Dad. Please, you have to believe me. I never wanted to hurt you. But Merle did not believe, because hidden in Garrett's voice wasn't remorse, it was fear. Fear of handcuffs, of courtrooms, of the life unraveling around him. That night a letter arrived, folded neatly, Garrett's handwriting still the same as when he was a boy scribbling homework. Dad. I know you think I betrayed you. Maybe I did, but everything I did was for Vera and me. You had your life, you built your house. I'm just trying to build mine. Please don't let them destroy us. You're still my father. You're supposed to protect me, not hand me over to the police. Merle read the words under the dim lamp, his hands trembling. The irony was a knife. His son, the boy he had carried on his shoulders, was now begging for the same protection he had shattered with his betrayal. For hours, Merle sat in the rocking chair, the letter on his lap, Edith's picture watching from the mantel. His mind wavered between the memory of a small boy running into his arms and the image of that same boy signing away the home where his mother had died. Half confession, half lie. It wasn't enough to heal. It wasn't enough to forgive. It only deepened the wound because it showed Garrett knew what he had done and yet still tried to twist it into something less than what it was. As midnight fell, Merle folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. He didn't throw it away. He didn't burn it. He simply left it on the mantel beneath Edith's photo, as though daring her memory to judge it for him. Outside, the wind howled around the maple tree, carrying with it a truth Merle could no longer ignore. His son's words were not apologies. They were bargaining chips, and the real war hadn't even begun. The courthouse in Blackfoot was an old stone building, its columns worn by decades of snow and wind. On that gray January morning, Merle stood at its steps with Quentin on one side and Brenda Martinez on the other. His breath clouded the air, and every step he took toward the heavy oak doors felt heavier than climbing 1,000 poles in the dead of winter. He never thought he would be here, not to testify against strangers, but against his own flesh and blood. Inside, the hall smelled faintly of polish and paper. The benches creaked under the weight of neighbors, townsfolk, even reporters with their small cameras. Blackfoot wasn't a big town, and word of a father suing his son spread faster than fire on dry grass. Merle sat at the plaintiff's table, hands folded tightly in front of him. Across the aisle, Garrett and Vera appeared with their attorney, a slick man in a tailored suit, his briefcase gleaming. Garrett wore a pressed shirt. Vera her sharpest blazer. But beneath the polished exterior, Merle saw it, the restless shifting of hands, the eyes that refused to meet his. When the judge entered, the room hushed. The gavel struck wood, echoing like thunder. Case of Ferris v. Ferris, the clerk announced. Allegations of fraudulent property transfer under expired power of attorney. Merle's chest tightened. To hear his family name spoken like that, Ferris against Ferris, was a wound deeper than the scar down his sternum. Brenda rose, calm but commanding. Your Honor, the evidence will show that Mr. Garrett Ferris exploited an expired power of attorney to unlawfully transfer his father's home into his own name. Furthermore, he leveraged that fraudulent transfer to secure a loan of $100,000, which he and his wife spent on personal gain. The judge nodded. And the defense, Garrett's lawyer stood smoothly. Your Honor, my client acted not out of fraud but misunderstanding. He believed the power of attorney remained valid and acted in his father's best interest. Any financial transactions were made under the assumption that the property was already his by inheritance. At worst, this is a case of clerical error, hardly grounds for criminal accusation. Murmurs rippled through the room. Merle clenched his fists. Inheritance. He was alive. Breathing, sitting right there in the courtroom, and yet his son was arguing as if he were already buried. Brenda calmly placed a stack of documents on the judge's bench. Exhibit A, the original power of attorney, clearly limited to medical matters and expired as of November 10th. Exhibit B, the deed transfer dated December 15th. Exhibit C, bank records showing immediate withdrawal of funds for a luxury vacation in Bermuda. These are not the actions of a man protecting his father's interests. Garrett shifted in his seat, his face pale, Vera's jaw tight as stone. The judge skimmed the papers, eyes narrowing. This case has merit. I'm setting a full hearing. Both civil and criminal charges will proceed. The gavel fell again. Court adjourned until February 3rd. The room buzzed with whispers. Merle stood slowly, his knees aching, his heart pounding not from weakness but from the weight of what had just begun. Garrett looked across the aisle at him, lips parting as though to speak. For a fleeting second, Merle saw the boy he had once carried on his shoulders, the boy who laughed when Edith baked cookies. But then Garrett's eyes hardened, and Merle saw the man who had sold his father's house for a vacation in the sun. Quentin touched his arm. Steady, Merle, this is just the beginning. As they left the courtroom, the cold air rushed in, biting but cleansing. Merle pulled his coat tighter. Inside, a voice whispered the truth. The courtroom battle had begun, and family or not, he would not back down. Nights after the first hearing were long and merciless. The house creaked with every gust of winter wind, the maple branches scratching at the glass like skeletal fingers. Merle would lie in his bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, waiting for sleep that never came. But it wasn't his heart surgery keeping him awake. It was the echo of a voice. Dad, we can fix this. Garrett's words from the confrontation replayed endlessly, blurring with the memory of him as a boy, laughing on Christmas morning. His hair sticking up in every direction, his small hands tearing wrapping paper while Edith clapped and smiled. How could that boy become the man who betrayed him for money and a vacation? The phone rang again. Past midnight, Merle stared at the glowing screen in the dark. Garrett. He hesitated, then pressed accept. Dad, Garrett's voice was broken, a shadow of the confident man who once strutted around in expensive shoes. Please, I can't sleep. I keep thinking about what happened. I messed up, I know, but you're my father. You can stop this. Just tell Brenda to drop the suit. I'll make it right. Merle's throat tightened. Make it right. You sold my house. You forged my name. You left me a message like I was already dead. Garrett's voice cracked. I was scared, okay. Vera pushed me. The bills kept piling, and I saw a way out. I thought I could handle it. I thought I deserved it. His breathing quickened. But I swear, Dad, I never stopped loving you. Please, I need you to forgive me. Merle closed his eyes, Edith's photo on the nightstand catching a glint of moonlight. Forgiveness. Was that even possible when betrayal ran this deep? The next day, a letter arrived in Garrett's handwriting, shaky and rushed. Dad, I know you hate me. Maybe I deserve it, but please remember I'm still your son. Vera's scared too, but we never meant to hurt you. We only wanted a chance. I'll give you the house back. I'll sign whatever you want. Just don't let them put me in jail. You're the only one who can stop this. Merle sat in his rocking chair, letter trembling in his hands. His chest ached not from stitches, but from the war inside him. On one side, the father's heart that whispered, protect him. He's still your boy. On the other, the man who had carried power lines in storms, who had buried his wife, who had built a house with his bare hands. That man whispered justice, respect, dignity. Some wounds can't be covered by words. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks of the old house, sounding almost like Edith's voice. Merle, don't let them break you. Merle folded the letter slowly, placed it in the drawer beneath the old family Bible. He would not burn it, he would not answer it. But as he sat in the chair through the endless night, the truth was undeniable. Betrayal may have made him strong, but forgiveness, or the refusal of it, would decide the rest of his life. The courthouse was colder this time, not because of the January frost, but because of the silence inside. Every bench was filled, neighbors, acquaintances, even strangers who had heard whispers of the Ferris case. Blackfoot was a small town, and betrayal of blood was not an everyday spectacle. Merle sat at the plaintiff's table with Quentin and Brenda flanking him. His chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, though his eyes betrayed the storm within. Across the aisle, Garrett fidgeted in his seat, his suit a size too sharp for the slouch in his shoulders. Vera sat stiff, her arms folded, her expression a mask of defiance that didn't quite hide the fear in her eyes. The judge cleared his throat. "We are reconvened for the matter of Ferris v. Ferris, Mr. Garrett Ferris. You may address the court." Garrett stood, his lawyer whispering something in his ear before stepping back. For a moment he looked everywhere but at his father, up at the ceiling. At the notes trembling in his hands, at the scuffed floorboards beneath his shoes. Finally, his voice cracked through the silence. "Your Honor, I admit I transferred the house. I used the power of attorney, but I swear I thought it was still valid." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Garrett's lawyer motioned for him to keep steady. "I didn't mean to steal from my father," Garrett continued, his voice louder now, desperate. "I only wanted to protect my family. Vera and I, we were drowning, bills, the mortgage, the loans. I thought the house was as good as mine already, that it was my inheritance. I just acted too soon." Merle's knuckles whitened as his hands gripped the table. Inheritance. The word stung like a whip. He was alive, breathing, watching, and yet his son spoke as though he were already in the ground. Garrett's eyes finally lifted toward him, watery, pleading. "Dad, I didn't mean to hurt you. I panicked." Vera, he glanced at his wife, then faltered. "We thought we'd lose everything. I thought I could fix it before you even noticed. Please, Dad, you know me, I'm not a criminal." The judge's gavel tapped lightly. "Mr. Ferris, remember you are under oath. Your statement must be truthful." Garrett's shoulders slumped, his voice dropped, barely audible. "Yes, I knew it was expired. I knew, but I told myself it didn't matter, that I deserved it. That he'd forgive me once it was done." The room went silent. No rustle of papers, no coughs, just the sound of Merle's breath catching in his throat. Here it was, the confession, not full, not clean, but undeniable, a half-truth cloaked in excuses. Brenda rose smoothly. "Your Honor, the defendant has just admitted he knowingly acted under an expired legal document. That is fraud by definition. We ask the court to recognize this as direct evidence of criminal intent." The judge nodded gravely. Duly noted. Merle sat frozen, his mind a whirlpool. His son had confessed, but not with remorse, only with the desperation of a man trying to save himself. Half-truths, half-excuses, and now came the question no one could answer for him. Was he here to see justice done, or was he here to watch his son destroyed? As the gavel struck, echoing through the chamber, Merle's heart ached under the weight of a truth he could no longer avoid. Sometimes justice and love are not only separate paths, they are paths that never cross again. News travels fast in a small town, and betrayal, especially betrayal that ends up in a courtroom, travels faster than the winter wind down Blackfoot streets. Within days of the first hearing, Merle could feel the shift. At the diner where he used to drink coffee, voices lowered when he walked in. At the grocery store, glances lingered longer than usual, some full of sympathy, others sharp with judgment. On one hand, there were those who rallied behind him. "Merle, you did right." Mrs. Johnson, his longtime neighbor, told him one morning as they met at the post office. "A son who'd sell his father's house while he lay in a hospital bed, that's not a son, that's a vulture. You taught this town how to work with your bare hands. Don't you dare let him trample your name." Others echoed her words, folks he'd once helped during power outages, people who remembered him climbing poles in storms so their children could sleep warm at night. To them, Merle was a hero wronged, a man standing tall against betrayal, but not everyone agreed. At church, he overheard whispers behind the pews. He's dragging his own son into court. How heartless can a man be? Another muttered, sure, Garrett made mistakes, but jail, that's his boy. Blood should forgive blood. The word stung worse than Garrett's letter. Forgive? Did forgiveness mean pretending the betrayal never happened? Did it mean letting your son walk free while your dignity was buried under lies? The local paper ran a column that fanned the flames even hotter. Ferris v. Ferris, justice or cruelty. The headline burned in Merle's eyes as he read it alone at the kitchen table. The article painted him as both victim and villain, an old man robbed of his house, but also a father who might ruin his son's life over a family matter that could have been resolved privately. That night, Merle couldn't sleep. He sat in his rocking chair, Edith's picture staring back from the mantel, the maple tree outside scratching against the window. He thought of Eugene Coleman, his friend from the hospital, who had said, "At the end, all that matters is the people who love you." But what if the people who were supposed to love you became the ones who cut you deepest? The voices of the town tangled in his head. You're brave, you're cruel, you're right, you're wrong. Merle gripped the arms of the chair, his knuckles white. For the first time, doubt crept in. Not about the law, he knew the facts were on his side. But about himself. Was he seeking justice or revenge? Was he a father defending his honor, or a bitter old man dragging his family name through the mud? Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the murmur of a town divided. Inside, Merle's heart wavered between pride and guilt, justice and mercy. And as midnight stretched into dawn, one truth gnawed at him. Sometimes the weight of community's judgment is heavier than the betrayal that caused it. The nights were no kinder. The town's voices echoed in Merle's head, accusations of cruelty, whispers of justice. But louder than them all were whispers from the past. One evening, while sorting through a drawer of old photographs, Merle found a worn picture. Garrett, at 8 years old, perched on his shoulders, grinning wide with 2 front teeth missing. Edith had taken the shot on the front porch, sunlight flooding the frame. For a moment, Merle's chest tightened, not with pain, but with a fierce longing. He heard it then, the echo of a boy's laughter. "Higher, Dad, push me higher." Garrett's voice as a child, begging him to push the swing harder. "You can do it, son, just keep pedaling." His own voice, steady and proud, teaching the boy to ride a bike down the gravel road. "Don't worry, Dad, I'll always take care of you." A promise whispered long ago, one that now felt like a cruel joke. Merle closed his eyes, gripping the photograph until his knuckles ached. Memories came uninvited, teaching Garrett how to hammer nails straight, building a treehouse together, sitting at the dinner table with Edith while their son recited spelling words. For years he had believed those were the foundations of a bond no storm could break, yet here he was, fighting his only child in a courtroom. The clock ticked past midnight. Merle sat in the rocking chair, Edith's picture watching from the mantel. Garrett's childhood photo in his hand. The house groaned under the winter wind, but inside the silence was filled with voices of yesterday. "Maybe I failed him," Merle whispered to the empty room. "Maybe somewhere along the way I worked too hard, missed too many dinners, left too much for Edith. Maybe I built the house, but I forgot to build the man." The thought cut deep. Was Garrett's betrayal a reflection of his own failures as a father? Or was it proof that no matter how hard you work, some seeds grow crooked in the soil? He didn't know. What he did know was this: the boy in the photograph was gone, replaced by a man who would trade his father's home for a week on a beach. But in the dead of night, Merle could still hear the echoes, the laughter, the promises, the warmth. And that was the cruelest part of betrayal. It never erased the love that came before. As dawn crept through the window, Merle placed the photograph back in the drawer and whispered into the quiet, "Edith, tell me, do I fight him to the end? Or do I let the boy he used to be save the man he's become?" The wind rattled the maple branches outside, but no answer came. Only the endless whisper of the past, reminding him of what he had lost and what he might yet lose again. The courthouse was quieter this time, fewer reporters, fewer neighbors, but the tension was no less sharp. Merle sat in the same seat, his hands folded, his heart steady but heavy. Across the aisle, Garrett looked worn, dark circles under his eyes, his posture slumped. Vera sat with her chin raised, but even her defiance seemed thinner, like glass ready to crack. The judge's gavel struck. "We are here to hear closing arguments." Brenda leaned toward Merle, her voice soft but firm. "This is it. If we press forward, Garrett could face jail time. If we agree to settlement, you'll have your house, restitution, and he walks with probation. The choice is yours, Merle. What do you want?" The question pierced deeper than any gavel could. What did he want? He thought of Edith's smile, the warmth of the house they built together, the promise of family dinners that were now just ghosts in photographs. He thought of the boy Garrett had once been, climbing poles in the yard with toy tools, saying, "I'll be just like you, Dad." Then he thought of the text, "Your house is sold, I left with my wife." The courtroom blurred as memories and betrayal clashed inside him. His fists tightened, his breath shallow. Ezra Singh, seated behind him, leaned forward and whispered just loud enough for Merle to hear. "Remember what you told me, Mr. Ferris. This isn't revenge, this is justice. Don't let them blur the line. Justice." "Revenge, father, son." Merle's eyes lifted to Garrett. For a fleeting moment their eyes met, the son's filled with fear and regret, the father's clouded with anger and grief. And in that silent exchange, Merle saw both truths, the boy who had once needed his hand to cross the street and the man who had sold his house behind his back. The judge's voice broke the silence. "Mr. Ferris, do you wish to proceed with full charges, or will you consider settlement?" The whole room waited, even the air seemed to stop. Merle's voice came low, rough, but steady. "I want my house back. I want the truth written down, black and white, and I want him to live with what he did, not as a son who walked away free, but as a man who carries the weight of his choices." The judge nodded. "Settlement terms will be recorded. The house returns to Mr. Ferris. Mr. Garrett Ferris will serve probation, pay fines, and perform community service." The gavel struck, final and unyielding. It was done. But as Merle rose from his seat, the weight in his chest remained. He had chosen justice, but whether it brought him peace, only time would tell. Spring came slowly to Blackfoot. Snow retreated from the fields, the maple tree outside Merle's window grew its first shy leaves, and the house, his house, once stolen and returned, stood steady again. On paper he had won. The deed bore his name once more. Garrett faced probation, fines, and the long shadow of shame. Vera disappeared from town whispers, her pride shattered. Justice, as the world measured it, had been served, but inside Merle's chest, the battle was not so easily settled. Some nights, sitting in his rocking chair, he still heard the echo of a boy's laughter, still saw small hands tugging at his sleeve, still remembered the promise, "I'll take care of you, Dad." Now the silence answered instead. One evening Merle walked out onto the porch, the sky painted with streaks of gold. He sat with Edith's picture in his lap, whispering as though she were near. "I chose justice, Edith, but it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like a wound stitched shut but still aching underneath." The wind rustled the lilacs, carrying a faint sweetness that softened the air, and in that stillness Merle understood something he hadn't before. Some betrayals can't be undone. Some bridges burn so completely that to cross back is to fall into ash. But life, stubborn as spring, keeps going. He didn't need revenge anymore. He didn't even need forgiveness. What he needed, what he finally chose, was peace. Merle leaned back in his rocking chair, watching the last light fade. He thought of all those who might hear his story and drew one final lesson from the marrow of his pain. Respect is not measured by wealth, but by sacrifice, and the deepest wound comes not from strangers, but from those you once called your own. Yet even then you can choose to live, to plan again, to begin again. That choice is yours. The night settled, the porch light clicked on, and Merle closed his eyes, not in defeat, but in quiet acceptance. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. If it touched your heart, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us about love, family, and the difficult choices that shape our lives.